Looking to understand while loops in Python? While loops are great tools to use when you're looking to repeat a piece of code. In this video, you'll learn everything you need to know about while loops, how they work, when to use them, and how to avoid common mistakes. Let's first familiarize ourselves with the syntax of a while loop. We'll start with a simple loop that prints the numbers 1 to 5. In Python, a while loop begins with the keyword while. We follow this keyword with a Boolean expression that tells Python whether or not to execute the loop. This Boolean expression is also called the while condition. In our example, we'd like the loop to run as long as the count is less than or equal to 5, starting from 1. To represent this starting point, we'll create a count variable and set it to 1. This variable will serve two purposes. We'll use the count variable in the while condition to test whether the count is less than or equal to 5. Later, we'll increment it to count to 5. Finally, we end the first line of our while loop with a colon. This line is called the while loop header. Note that when we press enter at the end of the header, our code editor automatically indents the next line of code. This is a feature, not a bug. Following the header, the lines of code that compose a while loop must be indented by one tab. The indented code within the while loop is called the body of the loop. The loop body is where we write the operations that should be repeated a number of times, and it ends with the last line of indented code. In other words, the first line of unindented code that follows is not part of the loop body. Awesome, let's now fill the body of the loop. Since our goal is to count from 1 to 5, we'll first print the count variable, and then increment it by 1. Lastly, we'll print the message to indicate the end of the program. And that's it! We have a while loop that should count from 1 to 5. Let's test this by running the code. Great, the loop does indeed count from 1 to 5. But before we move on, let's make sure we understand what happened behind the scenes when Python executed the loop. In the first line of code, Python initializes the count variable and sets it equal to 1. Moving to the while loop header, Python stops to test whether the count variable is less than or equal to 5. Since at that point, count equals 1 and 1 is less than 5, the Boolean expression evaluates to true and Python gets the green light to enter the loop body. Entering the loop, Python first prints out count equals 1 and then increments the count variable to store the value 2. Since we've reached the end of the loop body, Python returns the loop header and again tests whether the condition is true. Since 2 is less than 5, the expression evaluates to true, and Python gets the green light to enter the loop body again. During this iteration, count equals 2 is printed, and the count variable is incremented to 3. This process repeats when count equals 3, 4, and 5. At the end of the fifth iteration, the count variable is incremented to 6. When Python returns the loop header and tests the condition, it evaluates to false since count is no longer less than or equal to 5. Python gets a red light and is no longer allowed to enter the loop. The program then moves to the next unindented line of code and prints the end of the program message. Great, now you know how to write a while loop and understand how they're executed. While loops are one of two types of loops in Python. You may already be familiar with the more common for loop. But if not, be sure to check out our for loop video first. The link is in the description. Given that Python provides both while loops and for loops, you might be wondering, what's the difference between them? Are they interchangeable? Couldn't we have used a for loop to count from 1 to 5? Let's break down the key differences between the two and explore when to use one over the other. We could indeed count from 1 to 5 using a for loop. Here's how. We create a for loop with the for keyword, followed by the iteration variable count. Then, we use the range function to tell Python to generate a sequence of numbers from 1 to 5, which the loop iterates over. Lastly, we print the end of the program message. As you can see, the for loop produces the same output as the while loop with less code. This is generally true for tasks where we know the number of iterations before the loop starts running. When we have a task like this, for loops are the better choice. However, a limitation of for loops is that we must know the number of iterations in advance to use them. In practice, there are plenty of scenarios where we don't know the number of times a loop should run before it starts running. This is where while loops shine. For example, imagine you are coding a login system that asks the user to input their password. Since the user might enter the wrong password multiple times, you should keep prompting them for their password until they enter the correct one. The user might get their password right the first time, or it might take 2 attempts or 10 attempts. The point is, we don't know in advance the exact number of attempts the user will need before entering the correct password, secret 123. For that reason, while loops are the right tool for the job. Let's write a simple program to see how we can use a while loop to simulate a login system. First, we'll create a variable to store the user's input and set it equal to a placeholder value. Then, we'll write the while loop header, starting with the while loop keyword, followed by the while condition. Since we'd like the loop to keep running as long as the user has not entered the correct password, our while loop condition will test whether the user input is not equal to the correct password, secret 123. In the body of the loop, we'll ask the user to input their password using the input function. The input function pauses the execution of the code and prompts the user for input. By the way, if you want to learn more about user input in Python, make sure to watch our video linked in the description. Finally, once the user inputs the correct password, the loop stops running. Let's print access granted. When we run the code, we are prompted with an input box asking us to input our password. If we enter the correct password on the first try, the loop stops running immediately and we are granted access. But if we get our password wrong a few times, the loop will keep prompting us until we get it right. When taking user input, while loops gives us the flexibility we need since we can't always predict what users will enter. Great, now you understand when a while loop should be used instead of a for loop and how to use a while loop to take user input. But our current approach could be slightly improved. Right now, we test whether user input is correct before we even prompt the user for their password. But this is a little backwards. It forces us to assign user input a placeholder value before the while loop condition can be evaluated. Luckily, there's a way to fix this. Instead of creating the user input variable outside the loop and setting it equal to the placeholder value, we can remove this line of code and place the while loop condition with true. Now that we remove the while condition, we need another way for the loop to exit once the correct password is entered. To do this, we'll add the conditional block inside the loop to check whether the user input is equal to the correct password. Inside this conditional, we'll write the break keyword. The break keyword tells Python to stop executing the loop immediately and move on to the next line of code after the loop. Nice! Now we'll prompt the user for the password before testing whether they enter the correct one. This code should work the same as the first version. Let's run the cells to confirm this. If we enter secret 123 as the first attempt, the loop exits and access granted is printed. But if we enter a few incorrect passwords, we are continuously prompted until we enter the right one. Awesome! The while true syntax is great for interactive programs like this, but if you forget to include a break statement, your loop will run forever, creating what's called an infinite loop. To see how this works, let's comment out the conditional block and rerun the code. We are then prompted to enter a password, and another password, and another password, even if we enter the correct one. The program will ask us for passwords forever since there's no value we can input to break out of the loop. That's why it's important to always make sure there's a clear way for the while loop to exit, whether that's with while condition or with a break keyword. Awesome! Let's quick recap what we learned about while loops in Python. First, we covered the syntax and execution of a while loop. We saw that the while loop is made of a header and an indented body. The loop will run as long as the condition in the header remains true. Next, we compare while loops to for loops. We learned that for loops are great when we know how many times we need to iterate. But while loops are best when we don't know in advance how many times a loop should run. Finally, we explored the while true syntax, which helps simplify certain loops. We learned that we need to check for an end value that includes a break statement, otherwise the loop will run forever. Awesome! We're working on lots more Python videos like this one, so be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out. If you have any questions or topics you'd like to hear about, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching!